Hello, everybody. Just gonna wait for a couple minutes so that people can make their way in. Thank you, everyone, for your patience if you already got here, or for joining us if you are doing that as I'm speaking right now. Oh, there's a lot of people coming. It's very nice. Okay, we're actually up to a very nice big number. Um, I won't share it in case it's proprietary knowledge, but thank you, all of you, for joining us. My name is Jack Mirkinson. I am an editor at The Nation, and I am very, very pleased and honored and humbled, etc., to be moderating this panel with a superstar group of panelists. Uh, this is in collaboration with the folks at Palestine Legal. This is actually the second time we're doing this. We did a similar discussion last year. Um, and so the circumstances of us having to do these annual conversations are not great, but the fact that we have instituted this tradition, I think, is very nice. So we are here to talk about a couple of things. First, the current sort of state we all find ourselves in. I think it's safe to say that when we met last year, we were in a moment of deep political crisis, but also a moment of real opportunity for the Palestine movement. And I think a year later, we are in a moment of even deeper political crisis. But the opportunities have not abated. And so we are here with four people from across a variety of movements, backgrounds, experiences, to talk not only about the current state of repression of the Palestine movement and of really every other marginalized community you can think of in this country, but also about the way that those movements intersect and crucially, um, what role solidarity between all of these movements can play in beating back the forces of fascism, genocide, militarism, uh, you name it. I don't have to go through the whole list for everybody. We all know it's bad out there. Um, and so we're gonna talk about a lot of the bad stuff, but hopefully get into some of the hopeful stuff and try and point to some ways to make a better future for all of us. So I am joined today by, as I said, just a powerhouse group of people. It's like I am by about 500% the least impressive person uh, in this group, which is why I really will try to shut up in a second. But before that, I'll introduce them. We have Dylan Saba, who's a staff attorney at Palestine Legal. We have Mamadou Tall, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Africana Studies at Cornell University. We have Paramita Shah, who is the executive director and co-founder of Just Futures Law. And we have Krystal Two Bulls, who is the executive director at Honor the Earth. Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for giving up your time to be here. Um, I really appreciate it, and I think we're going to have a good conversation. Um, so, Dylan, I wanted to start with you because one of the things that we're here to talk about is the report that Palestine Legal recently released about basically the overall state of repression that Palestine Legal has been fighting and documenting over the past year. Um, and so I just wanted to ask you, first of all, um, well, and I should just interrupt myself to say everyone's going to go around and talk a little bit about some stuff that's relevant to their area of expertise, and then we're going to have a broader conversation among the five of us. So, Dylan, you have been doing all of this research. You've been fielding these many thousands, of legal cases that have come Palestine Legal's way. You've been really at the forefront of these kinds of fights. So, uh, what did you find? What did Palestine Legal find, broadly speaking, in this latest report? What do you see as the key sort of patterns of repression that are facing the Palestine movement? And at this moment, where do you see the challenges facing the movement, and where do you see any opportunities for the movement to make gains?
Thank you, Jack. Also, just thanks to everyone, my co-panelists, absolutely for sharing your wisdom with us this evening, coming in from various places, Mamadou all the way from Tunisia, and also everyone for attending and sharing your time with us today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Jack, as usual, you've asked me a question that it would probably take 2.5 hours to answer in its entirety.
Sorry.
Which is great. I maybe will scratch the surface on the kind of broad strokes of where we're at. But I do think this is really an opportunity to think about where we're going. I think that you correctly identified that we are in a moment of heightened repression, which also opens some avenues of solidarity, particularly with our cross-movement partners. And that's what I hope we are really able to dig into in this session today. But let me start with the report, which is, kind of what we are here to debut in a way. And some of you may be asking yourselves, right? So we compiled this report, and it's really a report for 2024, for last year, right? We are surveying the movement landscape for the calendar period of 2024, which, as I'm sure all of you know, was a colossal and historic year for the Palestine Solidarity Movement. But as we look out at the landscape today, right, we're faced with a new political reality, right? We have the Trump administration, and we have some really high-profile acts of political repression that have changed the news landscape, for one, for how this issue is talked about, and certainly kind of broaden the scope and the threats of political repression to beyond the Palestine movement. So you may be asking yourself, what's the point of taking a look at everything that was happening in 2024? And what I'm going to offer here is something that I've been saying for a long time, which is a lot of the repression that we're seeing, a lot of the threats that are being levered at the Palestine movement feel new, but in fact are not. In fact, are actually continuation of long-standing strategies, both by Israel lobby groups, but also by the political right more broadly, to target our movements, to raise the cost of political expression, and also to use racialized, racist frameworks for characterizing our movement. So I actually think it's extremely instructive to take a look at the legacy of these strategies of repression, and actually to show, by doing a deep dive on what we experienced and saw and recorded in 2024, how the repression against the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and likewise repression against our partners and other movements in this country rely on bipartisan infrastructure. Okay, so what did we see? We saw in 2024, of course, we saw a tremendous amount of mobilization. Our report is titled A New Generation for Liberation. And that's because we saw young people take to the streets and to the campuses in droves, many mobilized for the first time, not just around Palestine, but mobilized for the first time around any political issue, because they recognized that a genocide was being carried out in their name on their on their tax dollars, and really like through and with the consent and support of the institutions that they patronize. These are either, as students or places of worship or what have you. And that really mobilized a lot of young people. Um, and in response to that, we saw a tremendous, massive amount of crackdown and repression. And that's because the forces supporting Israel, US's policy with respect to Israel and Israel's aggression on Gaza and on the people of Palestine more broadly recognize that dissent in the United States, and particular dissent comprised of young people in the United States, poses a threat to the cultural position of Zionism in the United States. And that threat may not be enough to challenge the gears of power as they exist today. And we kind of saw that struggle play out over the course of last spring and into the Biden and then Harris campaign, in which we were not able to achieve the movement demands of an arms embargo and a ceasefire. But nevertheless, that growing cultural support for Palestinian liberation poses a medium and long-term threat to the viability of continued U.S. support for Israel. And we're seeing that reflected in the degree of repression that the movement is facing, but also bear out in the form of major public opinion shifts, right? So recent public opinion polling has demonstrated that the solidarity movement has moved the needle, has had an impact. And I think it's probably too soon to draw any major conclusions out of recent electoral news, but for those, paying attention, there may be lessons to learn there as well. So, okay, in terms of like the major trends of repression, what did we see? I want to hone in on one particular element, which is that a major strategy of repression has been to pose the solidarity movement, particularly on campuses, as a threat to the safety of other students, and in particular to the safety of Jewish students. What does that mean in particular? It means that the discourses around the student movement and student anti-genocide mobilization are slotted into this framework where you have the safety rights of some students on the one hand, and the speech expression rights of other students, namely the pro-justice Palestine students, on the other. This is an imbalanced framing, right? Because by privileging the safety of one group of students, right, over the safety of all students, and institutions have given themselves permission to actually infringe on the safety of the students mobilizing for justice, right? So they have allowed themselves to call in law enforcement to come onto campuses to come and brutalize students, and in the name of student safety, actually, ironically. And we saw that, as a large scale response to the student encampments in the spring of 2024. But also, as the spring turned to fall and the Biden administration turned to the Trump administration, we saw that same logic used to expose pro-Palestine students, anti-genocide activists, to the weaponization of immigration consequences, right? Again, in the name of safety, in the name of anti-discrimination. That mismatched framing, that mismatched comparison, where you have speech rights on one side and safety on the other side, relies on racialized logics, right? It relies on being able to portray the call for Palestinian liberation, the calls for equal rights, and the anti-genocide claims more broadly as a threat to safety, which relies on it relies in particular on anti-Palestinian racism, right? Equating the calls for Palestinian liberation with a threat to the physical safety of Jews more broadly and Jewish students on campus, and leveraging certain tropes about Palestinians, that the threats around terrorism, what have you. So that's a major trend that we saw and documented in the report and has really continued. And if you're paying attention to the rhetoric around the Palestine movement, you will see it everywhere show up. And I know and I hope we can hear from others on the panel that that is a familiar tactic. That is a familiar tactic to try and break the bonds of solidarity with movements. Okay, and I'm going to wrap soon, but I want to just name some challenges and some opportunities, right? So challenges, of course, are the intensity of the repression. We are seeing kind of a level of mobilization, both at the level of institutions, right? So kind of universities changing their policies to make it easier for them to go after anti-genocide organizing on their campuses, the law enforcement repression and the brutalization of students and other protesters, often in kind of gross violation of those individuals' rights under the First Amendment. Um, um, uh, um, so we're seeing, a tremendous like a tremendous increase and volume of repression, and that poses a challenge, right? Because it makes it riskier to speak out. Now, what we've seen is that students are continually facing down those challenges with bravery and continuing to organize, right? Because no matter how intense the repression gets, all over the country that recognize that what movement folks are facing here is nothing in comparison to what the people of Gaza are facing, genocide are facing every day. And so there continues to be people who are willing to speak out, kind of regardless of the political costs and the risks. Another challenge, though, is turnover, right? A lot of the movement has been centered around campuses. Every year, the most seasoned organizers on campus graduate and they leave, and there's a whole bunch of new energy, and a lot of times that means that new lessons have to be learned. And so that continues to be a challenge. But also there are opportunities, right? As we named, there's been major advances in terms of public opinion. And also there has been the focus on Palestine and the expansion of the kind of energy in the streets to oppose broader elements of, in particular, the Trump administration's wider repression against marginalized community has opened up some doors for potential avenues of solidarity between anti-ICE mobilizers in the streets and people who are continuing to come out for Palestinian liberation. Okay, I will stop there, but I'm looking forward to digging into any or all of these issues as through the remainder of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Dylan, and thank you for fielding uh, my incredibly broad questions so ably. Mamadou, let's turn to you. You really experienced quite directly the sort of nexus between the repression of the Palestine movement and the repression uh, of free speech and the repression of immigrants to the United States overall. If people don't know, you were targeted repeatedly for your participation in Palestine activism on campus, and successfully beat it back, and then was targeted again, and sued the Trump administration over its targeting of you, and ultimately decided to leave the country. So first of all, we're all very glad that you are healthy and safe, and away from all of the nonsense we still have to deal with over here. Uh, but I would just love to know from you sort of what that experience at the heart of the intersection of all of these different sort of levels of repression that people are facing has felt like, why you decided to sort of take matters into your own hands, both in terms of uh, taking legal action against the Trump administration, and then in terms of leaving the country. And then, like I asked Dylan, amid all of that, what has given you some kind of optimism in terms of your own experience, in terms of what you're seeing in the United States and around the world?
Yeah, thank you so much to Legal, and a massive shout out to my amazing co-panelists. It's an honor and privilege to be here. I think before I speak about my experiences with state repression, which I will go into a bit more detail, I think I want to just ground myself and ground this conversation in how and why I come to Palestine, right? And I always begin this with a quote by one of my mentors, Professor Siba Grovegi, in which he says that being black is not my color. Being black means that I understand that to be profoundly spiritual and to be connected to a history of suffering and injustice, to be connected to empire and the plantation, and then to understand all of human suffering, from the native population in Brazil to understanding the Holocaust very profoundly. Blackness encapsulates humanity in a very particular way because our trajectory as humans has made the black subject, a very particular subject of violence, dehumanization, and expropriation. I come to the Palestinian struggle questioning what is at stake. I am haunted by James Baldwin's fear, the death of a heart, the moral apathy. And for me, we always hear this, but I've often said that Palestine holds up a mirror. Palestine is a litmus test, not to say that we privilege Palestine over every other cause, but rather a recognition that Palestine makes clear and crystallizes so many contradictions of our world. And I think as a student of the Black radical tradition, and I understand that my own department in Cornell, being one of the first in the country, the Africana Studies department, was born out of struggle, right? It was born out of a moment of campus protest in which students were demanding of the institution and of the country and nationwide. And it was the moment of, again, a global reckoning on race at the time. I understand that I'm a part of a legacy and a tradition. And then coming to Palestine for me is trying to continue and being align myself with that tradition that also saw Zionism as an anti-Black movement as well, right? As an extension of white supremacy. So I come to Palestine as a student of the Black radical tradition. That is to say that I am aligning myself with a particular way of being in the world that understands that none of us are free until all of us are free, right? And again, I think it's important to note because whilst we're seeing a rising internationalism in this time, there's a deliberate attempt to fragment our movements, right? And I think we saw some of that during the encampment. We saw some of that with the level of repression. And I'll be quite frank, whilst I anticipated suspension. I anticipated forms of, maybe not being allowed to come onto campus or having to move to remote learning and distance learning. I don't think many of us anticipate, and I think Dylan, you ground this quite well. And I think maybe it comes to perhaps my own naivety because you can read the books and you understand the legacies of COINTELPRO, and you understand the legacies in which Black radicals have been targeted, assassinated, and killed, and exiled. You realize that you can read at the level of abstract, or it seems a bit abstract to you but however, communities are going through this. And I think the ways in which universities rolled over and capitulated so quickly to requests of the Trump administration was another watershed moment. And I think it was a forced radicalization. And I think what we're seeing with parts of Colombia previously, the more you repress, the more you produce opposite as well. Why I sued Trump? And I ask myself the same question every day. Why did I end up suing Trump? um, my personal thing was Cornell had placed target on my back. Cornell had placed target on my back, and it became very clear. I mean, just going through my Twitter mentions, Beta, New York Post had like a whole thing about me, and it's not first and foremost in my nature to be scared, and I don't think we should be scared. The state is not omnipotent, right? We are in a moment where actually The fact that they have to mete out such level of repression, for me, is the Gramscian notion that it indicates a weakness, right? When power has to show itself in this way, for me, it shows you it's not. It shows that there's a growing discontent with the status quo, and I think whilst materially it's horrific what we're seeing in Gaza, what we can say at the same time is that I think Zionism ideologically has begun to lost the public debate, and that should be something that we tap into. But given that my high profile nature of my suspension, it was, I just didn't, first of all, I didn't want to be a sitting duck. And I thought to myself, my case represents, it converges so many issues of race, Islamophobia, being an immigrant in a country, going through the carceral nature of the university and the state itself. I knew I was going to become a target. And basically, my legal team presented the option, you're going to be a target. Now, what do you want to do? You can either be quiet, you can either see if they don't target you, you can either just try to finish. And I talk about the crazy story that I was doing my exams whilst being in hiding for 2.5 weeks, which is another crazy story. But we filed the lawsuit because I thought that I didn't want to be a sitting duck, but we were seeking a nationwide injunction, not just for myself, but for similarly situated persons as well. I anticipated a long drawn out court battle with the potentiality of it ending in the Supreme Court. And obviously, boy, was I wrong. I think we filed the lawsuit on maybe a Friday or Saturday. And then the next day, I had received a call from someone from, I won't say the name, but who someone said, "Oh, Mamadou, the FBI and ICE are looking for you right now." A day after that, I received an email from Meta and X and Gmail that my social media is being subpoenaed, my emails are being subpoenaed, and if I don't reply within 14 days of a lawsuit, Meta, X, and Google Mail will hand over my communications. Just for the record, I did file the lawsuit. We won that, and my records were not handed over to the. And again, it was interesting. Again, why this was spanning the work because they had nothing, and I know they have nothing because in the Tal versus Trump case, when you read, which is not publicly available, when you read Trump's the lawyers that talk about myself and my situation, it's not that I've been violent, it's not that I've been arrested, etc. They literally say that I created an unsafe, uncomfortable environment for Jewish students on campus, right? And I think there's such an irony because what could be more uncomfortable and unsafe than having the FBI at your house, right? What could be more uncomfortable and unsafe than I had to literally go into hiding for 2.5 weeks where no one could have access to me, and I had to do all the precautions. And it was Ramadan and I was fasting as well. So it was a very intense 2.5 weeks. Again, I was then told I must surrender myself to ICE custody, which that was never going to be the plan. And I think I think my leaving the United States was not planned. It was deeply abrupt. It was literally, I think, the day before I decided to leave, we had received an unfavorable ruling from the judge. The judge basically started off the case because what the government had said that, oh, this is not retaliate. We have not revoked Mohammed's visa out of retaliation for him filing the lawsuit. Rather, we are revoking his visa. We revoked his visa one day, coincidentally, before he filed the lawsuit, right? And so the judge basically started off the case. She was a Biden judge, recent to the bench, Biden appointee, and she effectively started off the case by saying, "I'm inclined to believe the government's position." And just before she ruled from the bench, luckily, we filed a temporary restraining order, and then she set a new briefing schedule. But I think what had happened in the interim, as we're preparing for the second hearing, my lawyer said to me, given the state of the judiciary right now in the US, we can't even guarantee that a favorable ruling from the judge would guarantee your safety, that you're able to walk the streets in that moment. And that was at that moment, I think that was like at 8 p.m. on a Sunday. And then by 11 p.m., this is public knowledge as well, a comrade kind of came up to upstate New York. I had packed my bags the next day and I had left. But this is not for me a sad story, right? It's just I know why I did it. And I think there was moments where there was some lull, especially in the campus movement, and I saw it re-energized people as well, right? And again, there is definitely pitfalls, and I never advocate making an individual the face of a movement ever. But I think it was a moment where the forms of repression had silenced so many voices that it became a thing of if an international student in a precarious position can take a stance, then others will be willing to take a stance as well. And others could see that it was clearly just unfair and unjust, and that kind of motivated lots of people as well. But I say it now as I'm quite, healthy, safe, and I'm doing very well. I say that the best thing that the Trump administration could have done to me is to force my self-deportation. And it sounds a bit ironic or strange, but because it allowed me to leave the belly of the beast in many ways and go around the world. I left the States in Canada, I was in Cuba, and then I was in Senegal. But I was in places where the question of Palestinian liberation was not even a question. And I think when you go to places like Cuba and then the question of Palestinian solidarity and the question of even in Senegal, for questions of Palestine, like they see our histories of histories of African colonialism against African nations, and the liberation of Palestine to be connected. And I think it's important that people realize that whilst you might be you're on the front line and you can almost feel like we're in the minority, but we're actually in the global majority. And that has been clear from my countries, like the global South countries. It's not a question of Palestinian liberation. And I think that's why I keep trying to remind people that whilst when you see, it's very difficult kind of to see, okay, people are getting suspended, people are being disappeared, etc. And these things are horrible. But when you step back, or if you allow yourself to step back or hear accounts of people who have been able to leave the United States, that we are actually in the global majority, and that the issue of Zionism for me is ideologically has lost. Now, that's not to say that, of course, materially we have an issue and we have to deal with that. But I do think that we are at a critical moment where internationalism is gaining renewed importance as a key framework for understanding contemporary politics. Internationalism, as articulated by figures like Kwame Ture, for me, underscored the importance of solidarity and shared struggles across national boundaries and border boundaries. And what keeps me optimistic have been my travels. I think we are the global majority, history is on our side, and free Palestine.
Thank you so much. And I think what you were just saying about uh, actually recognizing that most of the people on this planet are in support of Palestine and not in support of the kind of repression that we're talking about is a very useful thing to remember, and also has a real connection to the kind of domestic solidarity that we're talking about in this conversation as well. So Paramita, over to you. You have been um, fighting these kinds of legal battles for quite some time, and you have a lot of deep experience uh, navigating the post 9/11 era of repression. Not that we've particularly exited the post 9/11 era of repression, but the immediate post 9/11 phase. Um, so to your eyes, what feels different right now? What feels new? And what feels like you've seen this movie before? And what lessons are you drawing on from your past experiences to guide you and to guide the rest of us during this political moment?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, thank you for having me on today. It's been honestly an honor and a pleasure to hear the amazing Mamadou and Dylan and to meet my co-panelists. It's really an honor to be in space with you. So thank you for having me today. Well, I feel a little aged, but I will say that my career started before 9/11. And so many of this road feel feels like very similar, and then also incredibly scary, and the way that this road is beginning to change, and very quickly. So when 9/11 happened, and most of my career has been spent as a deportation defense lawyer, working on enforcement issues on immigrant rights, and I think this is where DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, was born, right? In 2003, after the Homeland Security Act was passed. And actually, DHS was set up, 11 days, right, after 9/11. That was like the fervor, the reactive mindset that we had at that time, where people wanted this agency. They wanted a domestic paramilitary agency to root out terrorism. And this is where we got to not just war on countries, but the war on terror, right? And national security. These all became code words for who was desirable, who was unsafe, who was scary. This is where I remember seeing Guantanamo being a place where people were sent there and there was no way to bring them back to have a trial. And there are still people in Guantanamo, right, who have not left there, and who are facing, just a detainment that will never end, despite what we see now. And I know that this administration is considering an expansion, right, of potentially up to 9,000 people in Guantanamo at this moment. So there's so many similarities. The registration process that happened right after 9/11 for any young man over the age of 16 who was from a Muslim majority country. That was at first part of the axis of evil and then spread out. The language means something, and then the law followed, right? And what I think we have now is something where we can see Guantanamo being used again, right? We have CCOT in El Salvador. We are not afraid to send people and deport them to third countries, no matter what their safety is like. And really, I think this is not unusual for me, because when DHS was started, it was started really to be a paramilitary agency. It was started because there was no civil rights agency, in the way that the Department of Justice has one. We know that it doesn't work, but there wasn't even a belief that they needed one, right? When 9/11 happened, there were 5,000 people, in detention. Now there are, when during the Biden administration, during parts of the first Trump administration, 30,000. Now we're up to 60,000, right? And I think, we haven't really realized, and even though I believe in solidarity, and I am thinking about what are the moves we can make in the future, I also believe in clear eyes, for this moment. And the clear eyes means that we have a federal agency which has more armed federal agents, than any other, except for the Army, right? And when you have that kind of power, where Congress is about to, I think, give the detention budget an increase of 15 times, what it has, it will double the size of DHS. We know, as we can see right now, as DHS is disappearing people off the street, breaking windows, pulling people into vans, where they are actually, going into people's homes potentially in the very early morning. These are all signs of terror that the government is seeking to use to scare us into thinking that, we cannot fight a paramilitary agency that is doing the good work, right, of national security. That is the message that I think we all hear. Um, some of the things that feel very different to me is not only the size and shape of DHS, but the way that the Supreme Court is shaping immigration law. And the way that they are reshaping immigration law is to, you know, kind of entertain what used to be fringe battles, right, around birthright citizenship, fringe legal theories around who constituted an alien enemy, right? Kind of regurgitating these old antique laws, right, to detain people and politically persecute them. Those are other signs of an authoritarian agency that make me very worried right now at this point. But I really do think their end goal is I have a colleague who likes to call this the everywhere border, right? And the everywhere border is not just the border that we see, at the southern border or in the airport or at the sea. This is a border that our government at this point wants to set up, between people, between communities, between services, between state and local governments, between state and federal governments, and local and federal governments. The everywhere border is actually the threat. It is like a proposition that we need borders to operate as a nation, right? And so when you have kind of like this ingestion of an idea that the everywhere border makes you safe, you can believe a lot of things from a paramilitary agency that is promising you a lot of safety, right? To me, there is no safety in having 60,000 people in detention. There will be no safety in having an agency like this endowed with $170 billion, right? There is no safety in an agency that is not held to accountability when people are being held without knowing what are the charges, that are being moved around the country where they cannot be found, that are being deported without a hearing. And I know that the courts don't feel especially important right now, but they are. And I don't think it's just because I'm a lawyer. I have often been on the losing side. I think we are kind of reckoning with, using my clear eye as what do you do when Congress is co-opted, when the executive is co-opted? Then you have to think about how are you going to use the law, right? And so this kind of brings me, especially now that we see that the billionaires are kind of joining in, I think, along with um, this administration and defining how governance is going to work, and that's maybe the last thing that I'll add is like the additional thing, right, that's happening at this moment that didn't happen before. When we see corporations like Palantir, when we see corporations like Clearview AI, which are often using wartime technologies brought in from Gaza, right, that are brought in from Ukraine, and they are deploying these technologies at the border for DHS, which will then eventually migrate, right, to police departments as they get normalized over time. I remember thinking like that is the way where this idea of governance, which is supposed to be providing public goods, is going to now be about the government that is about providing national security. And now national security is the public good. Um, I think that when you have these corporations that are kind of working at all these levels of government, um, I think that will come not only at the cost of privacy, but at the cost of democracy and some collective action. And it's something that I know that DHS is really excited about because I remember when there was a border security conference, I think the ICE director summarized his goal for DHS is that he wanted the deportation system to run like Amazon Prime, but with human beings, right? And so when you have that kind of mentality, between, I think, corporations and our government, it's just a lot of power. And now I think we have to get creative. In the way that we build solidarity, we have to think about maybe we're not going to win at national class actions, but what can we build at the local level, right? What are we going to build with our neighbors so we don't have an everywhere border, right? That not just talks about how they're going to politically attack sanctuary city leaders, how they're politically going to attack mayors who are standing up to our government, but how do we corral around them, right? Who are thinking about how to talk about immigrant rights and care. I think I am thinking about litigation at the local level, right? What does that look like, instead of thinking about national class actions? But most importantly, I think it's not just an immigrant rights problem, right? This is not just a deportation problem. This is a question of solidarity. How do we bring all our battles across our sectors? To think about how we can build cross-sector litigation strategies, legal strategies, but also, of course, organizing strategies above all. So that's probably where I'll leave it. But thank you for having me, and we can move on.
Thank you so much, Paramita. And I think the connection to the post 9/11 era is so important to bring up because apart from all of the similarities we're seeing now, it's also a real lesson in um, how this sort of architecture of repression can be really institutionalized at a rapid pace and become just part of the framework that we all live under before we even fully know what's going on. Um, and as uh, we're talking while um, this gigantic bill in the Senate is currently being debated and voted on, that could supercharge some of the forms of repression that we're talking about. I think that's really something to keep in our minds. Last but extremely not least, I want to turn to Krystal. And thank you so much for hustling back from a personal engagement to be here with us. We really appreciate it. You have been participating in activism around indigenous rights, around environmental rights. Most notably, you were a participant in the historic struggle at Standing Rock, which was another moment of really intense repression against a popular uprising, I think it's fair to say. Um, and so I'm wondering what resonances you're seeing now that chime with the kind of work that you're doing, and also how you understand the link between the fight for indigenous rights and environmental rights and the fight for Palestinian liberation.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Piveshev, Mene Wosta Nanehav. My name's Krystal Two Bulls, as Jack so graciously introduced. I'm Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne. My peoples come from Northern Cheyenne territory in southeastern Montana, which is where I'm located. Yeah, just to kind of go back a little bit about my own connection and relationship that is the through line between environmental justice, indigenous rights, Palestinian organizing, liberation. It really goes back to, Standing Rock. I was organizing around Palestine prior to that, but really at Standing Rock is where Palestinian folks showed up on the ground for us, made a commitment to be there for a certain amount of time, be with us, stand with us. And I had spoke on a panel talking about the intersections of our work at that time as well, really similarly to now. And the Palestinian person on the panel shared about the olive tree and the burning, the strategic in the militarized burning of the olive tree and what that represented to Palestinian peoples. And it just gutted me in that moment. Like I really had a hard time because I understood viscerally the spiritual and cultural and physical connection to um, what the olive tree represented to Palestinian people, because that's what they did to my people when they destroyed the buffalo. And so my people have the same teachings and the same relationship and connection to the buffalo. We're known as buffalo people. And we used every piece of the buffalo for our survival and for teachings, for how to be in this world, all of these things. And so the strategic killing of buffalo, there's a historic photo, folks can Google it. There's this mountain of buffalo skulls that's just piled up. And that really represents the colonization of my people, right? The attempted genocide on us. And I really related to the story of the olive tree in that way. And so from that moment forward, this was my fight. There's no separating those things out anymore. And so I carry it that way, and it makes me go all the way back to like 1492 with my people's resistance. We've been fighting since the first settler stepped foot on our lands, and we have not stopped since, despite, right? And so I really relate to a lot of things that are going on currently that we're watching happen, right? There's newer technology. The oppressors might look different, be named different, but it's very similar to what my people experienced. And I carry it that way. You fast forward to like the 1970s, the American Indian movement, when our people and our leaders really started to organize, really started to resist. We deployed many different occupations all across Turtle Island, most notably in Washington, D.C., when we occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but also whenever the occupation of Wounded Knee. And I name Wounded Knee specifically because Palestinians showed up. And they helped pull security and they stood with us while we were there through the entire ordeal. You go forward even farther to the United Nations when my people first started to attend the United Nations to advocate for our rights, and Palestinian people were already there. And despite being non-voting members, showed my people the ropes of how to navigate the UN system, right? And then you go even farther forward to Standing Rock, as we referenced, right? And Palestinian people made that commitment to be on the ground with us, to fight alongside of us on whatever lands they're on, right? And I hear that is a teaching that is really common amongst Palestinian revolutionaries, that whatever lands you're on, wherever you're at, you fight with those struggles as well, right? And I feel that and I carry that with me. We learned so much during that time. I think during that time, we learned a lot from like the boycott and divestment campaigns. We learned how to do that and we're able to successfully take on Wells Fargo and divest millions of dollars from them and really force them into like not passing policy to not invest into the fossil fuel industry anymore, right? We also obviously encountered the surveillance technology, the Israeli surveillance technology during that time as well. Private security forces that were also, working the detention centers and the prisons in so-called Israel, right? They were also on the ground at Standing Rock. The police forces, who were trained by the IDF, were also part of an interstate compact that we faced off with at Standing Rock, right? So there were so many intersections there that we really did rely on our Palestinian relatives to like learn lessons, right, from both of our struggles, whether it's occupations or whether it's from surveillance technology and IDF training, right? And then you come even further into the current moment when, my Palestinian sister climbed with me in Rapid City, South Dakota, known as Racist City, because of how extremely violent settlers are towards Native people and Indigenous peoples in Rapid City on our own territories, in the sacred Hesapa Black Hills for us. It's not uncommon for there to be so many different murders and killings of our people just for existing in Rapid City, right? And so we climbed a massive grain silo and we dropped an upside down flag that said land back. And basically declared that this is our land and our people have every right to be out here. And so it was a Palestinian sister of mine who stepped forward with no training whatsoever, and climbed with me on that day. And so we have a long history of fighting repression and fighting along next to each other, right? But also looking at the intersections with environment, right? Is the greenwashing. I think that happens is the most relatable thing for us. National parks, we were strategically removed. The narrative in the so-called US is that, national parks are there to maintain and keep these lands pristine, right? The only reason that they are pristine is because my people stewarded those lands and care took those lands since time immemorial. So what did they do is they forcibly removed us and turned them into national parks to further disenfranchise us and prevent us from being able to return home, right, to those lands. We see that happening in so-called Israel as well. National parks being created, right? And then you have the narrative around making the desert bloom, right? The desertification. Oh my gosh, I always get tongue-tied on that piece. But we see those narratives come out, right? When I heard a young Dene woman really push back on that narrative and saying that we have to plant invasive species on these lands and make it look like other lands in order for it to bloom, in order for it to be beautiful, when that's a false narrative. Because any indigenous person that comes from a desert, they know that it does bloom, right? It's just that you have to be able to see the value in how it is doing that, right? But if you are a colonizer, you don't see value in that, right? And so that is like one distinct thing that she named, and I was really proud of her. She was a young woman that brought that forward and pushed back on that narrative, just like saying the desert does bloom already, right? But also looking at the largest institutional polluter in the world, right? The U.S. military. So really bringing that intersection of militarism and environmental justice is, the history of the U.S. military is built around indigenous resistance. I think a lot of folks, practically just think that the U.S. military was formed after all of these militias, like state militias, the colony militias came together, created the U.S. Army, right? However, where you see all of the major U.S. installations, military bases in the country, are where there was the largest indigenous resistance, right? The supply routes, major interstate systems and highways that you see are historic supply routes for the predecessors of military bases, which are forts, right? You see that many of our communities are still named after those forts, like Fort Hall, Fort Peck, Fort Belknap. That's only in my state. There's hundreds of our communities that are still named after military bases. You also see the militarization of the border wall, right? Where Israeli technology is being tested on Atum people, on Pima people, on Yaqui people, right? On all of the indigenous nations that exist in those territories. And so we currently have all of the struggle and the resistance happening there. And then with the border wall, right? On this like imposed and fake colonial border. You also see, referencing again the idea of trained police forces that we're seeing show up in the streets with ICE at Standing Rock, at any resistance that's happening in these cities, right? Private security forces that were at Standing Rock are also at Israeli prisons. But also, I think one thing that's notable is that the very weapons and the equipment being sent to quote unquote Middle East for these forever wars that we're engaged in are named after my people, right? The Apache, the Black Hawk, the Chinook, the Lakota, the Sioux, even the code name for the Bin Laden mission was called Geronimo, after one of our indigenous leaders, right? And so we see these intersections as they are using our names and our people to weaponize weapons against other indigenous peoples who are simply trying to exist, right? Um, and that all goes back just to tie things together is and I always talk about this. It's a very, very simplified way of looking at the world. And so forgive me if it's too simple, but I work with a lot of young people. And so I always go back to the doctrine of discovery and what this so-called country was founded on, right? The doctrine of discovery basically said super simply that if there are no Christians on these lands, those lands can be claimed on behalf of a queendom or a kingdom or the sovereign, right? The Pope. And so that opened the door to settler colonialism here on these lands, in particular in the United States. It is not where everything started, but this is our story of US imperialism, right? And US empire. And so that opened the door to settler colonialism enforced by US militarism, right? They were the ones that enacted genocide. They were the ones that removed us from our territories. And in the name of capitalism, right? To gain access to land, to gain access to resources, right? But that template of having opening the door for that settler colonialism is now being used in going overseas to other indigenous peoples' lands, right? So the U.S. military goes over in the name of democracy or humanitarian aid or protecting women's rights or whatever narrative they want to give us, right? And then that opens the door for these corporations to have uninhibited access to resources and land, right? In the name of capitalism. And then that template, US imperialism, right? But who keeps us in forever wars? It's US politicians, right? They are being paid off. Their campaigns are being completely paid for by corporations. These corporations need access. Now our politicians who are supposed to represent us, which we know do not, now are beholden to these corporations, right? And I think I name that because we can't we can't fix a home when it's on a broken foundation, right? We have a flawed foundation that was built on slavery, that was built on white supremacy, that was built by indigenous peoples and black folks that were kidnapped from their lands, right? And it doesn't matter how many times we repaint this house or how many times we fix the doors, fix the windows. We are on a flawed and cracked foundation And anyone that knows construction, that's not going to work. We have to actually go back to the roots of it. And for me, that is where our solidarity is really going to shine through, is I think we have to continue to stand with each other to dismantle these things at the root causes of where they're coming from. And to me, that is the strength of our solidarity and why I continue to stand with Palestine, and will continue to. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank all four of you, for a really incredible um contribution, each of you. As you can see, I'm so impressed. I'm almost speechless. We have about a half hour to go. We're just gonna have a bit of a broader conversation with everyone. Um, and I guess actually, Krystal, where you left off was a really perfect place to start this other part of the conversation. Because, everything you mentioned about how not just the political, social, militaristic linkages that there are between the repression of indigenous communities and the repression of Palestinians, but also the linkage between your two movements, both more broadly and also very directly. I think, it really sort of points points the way to a lot of what we are trying to build on in this conversation. And one of the things that I've really witnessed in terms of the Palestine movement and broader movements is that there's often an attempt either to ask, like, well, like, why does that have anything to do with our movement or this issue? And like, why are we sort of thinking about this on the one hand, and also to draw Palestine as like a red line, and like if you try to pull that into your sort of broader framework, you will be punished for that. There will be severe consequences for trying to bring that in to how you think about the world, essentially. And so I guess I would love to hear from people when you sort of get that in your own day-to-day work or activism or organizing. What do you say to people in response? Why is Palestine relevant, um, to all of these other movements that we can think of beyond just the ones represented here? The queer movement, the reproductive justice movement, the movement against corporate domination. That's just off the top of my head. Why does Palestine matter to all of your different struggles? I can pick someone, or whoever wants to go can can talk about it.
I'm happy to share just some brief thoughts, Jack.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's okay. I know that I'm here as the Palestine representative, so not quite the orientation of the question you asked, but I really just actually wanted to jump in and really just acknowledge what my other panelists shared, because I think it was really, really insightful and valuable, and actually really helped me come to new insights about the relationship of Palestine with the broader movements, and in particular, Krystal, I think your comments about doctrine of discovery are not, that is not an oversimplification. I actually think that one of the key lessons of this moment that we're in is that we have not moved beyond the doctrine of discovery, that that is still in force. And funny enough, when you go to law school, one of the first cases, if not the first case that you read in property law is a case called Johnson v. McIntosh. And this is not, I don't need people to go read legal cases, but just by way of illustration, it's the first case you read. It's foundational to US property law, and it affirms the doctrine of discovery, and it is basically good law, right? This is a decision written by Chief Justice John Marshall, who is heralded in the US legal system as being basically the father of the Supreme Court in the US legal system. Um, and the case lays out exactly what Krystal articulates, and we are seeing that logic play out on the ground in Palestine. Of course, it still plays out on the ground in the United States, and I think to Paramita's point about the everywhere border, that's also what we are seeing. What we're seeing is that the U.S. practice of colonial genocide, which it began at home against the indigenous population here, has been globalized. And perhaps that is the story of the 20th century, or the back half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, is the US rising to be a unipolar power and universalizing its program of colonial genocide, both directly and through its proxies, at the world. And I think that is in part that the horrors that we are seeing play out on the ground in Palestine, and not only the horrors as in the physical violence and destruction, but the horror of watching our elected leaders condone and endorse that violence, and beyond that, actually supply it and encourage it, and name it as state policy, right? And not just our leaders on the right, but our leaders of the supposed left of center party, right, being the face of that destruction, shows that this is bipartisan policy. It's not aberrant. It is what we are doing loudly and proudly. And I think the only way to understand that is as the continuation of centuries of colonial violence. The only way to understand that is a continuation of the Indian Wars, where these military strategies were founded and practiced and debuted, and that what we're seeing right now is not an exception to some norms of practice or the laws of war, but actually the foundational elements of our global system being played out. And so what does that mean in terms of solidarity, right? I think it means that for those of us in the Palestine movement, we need to look at the long history of colonial genocide and of oppression to understand our enemy, to understand what we're up against and its constitutive logics, right? Which includes understanding indigenous resistance, doctrine of discovery, and settler colonial expansion on this land. But I also think that the lessons go both ways, right? It's also a two-way street, because I think understanding that what we're up against in Palestine is the continued presence of some of these older forms of domination, means that other movements need to look and see what's happening to the Palestine movement and understand that insofar as their movements pose a threat to the interests of US empire, they will be meted out with the same type of repression. And in particular, I just want to name, because we're talking about the law, right? And the law as strategy of resistance, fighting back, potentially a backstop to the excesses of other branches of government. I think we also need to name its limitations, right? So, like, the primary demand through all of 2024, and in particular in the lead up to the election, was the imposition of an arms embargo on Israel, and to stop US from sending its weapons. And the reason I'm bringing that up here is because that was actually a very mild demand, in that it was already what was required by US laws that were on the books, right? So really the demand of the movement is say, hey, to the US government, you have laws that say if a recipient of US aid is breaking the laws of war, is engaging in war crimes, and is also preventing population from accessing food and water and basic necessities, then that U.S. aid has to cease, right? And and we were making that demand on a democratic administration, right? So in theory, it is a very mild demand simply to say enforce the laws that are already on the books. And nevertheless, we were rebuffed, right? Nevertheless, they said no. And we failed to achieve that. And I think I think we need to be honest about that and also be honest about what that means, right? In thinking about strategies moving forward, right? It's actually simply not enough to frame the demands in the language of reformism, in the language of the state, in ways that are acceptable from from the position of the U.S. legal system, because if they are a threat to empire, the interests of empire, if they get in the way of that, settler colonial expansion, colonial genocide, then they can be ignored. And so I think that for all of us in all of our movements, especially as the political stakes continue to rise, right, and as the threats that we face as communities and as a community of nations grows, and in particular, as the US, Israel, some of these forces lose their cultural power and increasingly rely on domination by force, then that's going to have real strategy implications, right? And I don't think it's within the purview of this group of people, and particularly not the lawyers among us, to answer those questions of strategy. But I do think we need to talk about the limitations and the limitations that we've been exposed to over the past year.
Anybody have anything they want to say about what Dylan said? Okay. Going once.
I
Oh,
mean,
go ahead.
I guess, I would just say for the immigrant rights movement, and I'm definitely not, I can't speak for everyone in it, right? But I think one thing that was especially felt that it was so important to stand by the work, at least speaking as, legal organization, is that it is really important to protect institutions that do some of the work around thinking through suppression of speech and suppression of of association. And it felt like the political persecution that is such a strong through line in this administration required the use of whatever tools, that you had. So while organizing is to me the most important tool, and demands from, organized people, it is then, I think it was important for us to think through, as a legal organization, how to use the courts to defend it as well. And that just to me goes to thinking through about what movement lawyering is. And I would say second is that, on a very elemental level, like migration is something that is so fraught. We migrate money, we migrate bad business, and we don't allow people to migrate, right? We don't allow people to be in their homes. We don't allow, we have very, uh, as a nation, we have made foreign policy decisions that are damning us and are continuing to break the foundation. As Krystal said, that we actually need to course correct. And so I felt like the through line of migration, and how people are treated, the power of state violence that has been brought against the Palestinian community in the United States, against advocates for Palestinian rights, was something that was a litmus test and should be a litmus test, right, for all of us. Because if we can't, being part of the immigrant rights community where it's been really a place where people have experimented new technologies, new enforcement policies, new policing practices, just because the kind of protocols that DHS is held to is so low, right? You've never really been able to get accountability from this agency. That at some level, it became a really important litmus test, for the last few years. So I think that's where some of us came from as we thought about, immigrant rights and its connection to Palestinian rights.
Thank you. I think one of the other things that was a thread for me across all of your individual contributions uh, was sort of this idea of turning what has seemed to be consensus into a contested kind of space, whether that is the consensus around um, like indigenous rights to land, whether that's the consensus around what kind of activism it's appropriate to engage in on campus, the consensus around the level of state surveillance and repression that we, should be used to, or especially the overarching consensus that support for Palestine is anathema, um, and that is it's not something that anyone, or at least anyone particularly important, really believes in. And so I think all four of you are examples of people who are challenging and have challenged all of those different attempts to create these new sort of realities that everyone has to live under. And so I'm just wondering where people see right now, some of the cracks in those efforts to cut off any debate about these issues, to uh, force all of us to sort of be resigned to the state of the world as we find it. Where do you see those points of contestation happening right now? And what opportunities do they create in your minds?
Uh, I think I'm understanding the question. I mean, for me, what I'm looking at is like, what are they defunding? You know what I mean? I mean, they're obviously defunding things for a certain reason. I know it's a very simple way of looking at it, but really like gutting the education system, gutting media, continuing to monopolize media, right? An uneducated population is easy to control. And I mean, it's just really simple. And so like gutting those things. So it's like, the intersections of education and in Palestine, the education and indigenous rights and the environment, right? So I think at all of the intersections is where I'm really looking at even just for myself, like I'm rural, right? Like not only am I a Native American woman who lives on a reservation, but I also live in rural Montana. We're an all red state. Rural Montanans like really came out for Trump. They really came out for this current administration and are still backing that. But what we're seeing now is that they're gutting environmental protections and they're trying to sell off public lands. Well, Montana is known for our public lands. Republican Montanans love their public lands and now are feeling targeted and attacked. So I think the lesson there is that none of us are safe, right? It doesn't matter who you voted for. It doesn't matter how supportive of this administration that you think you are. Like none of us are safe in this moment, right? We can all become targets in the matter of moments if we disagree with anything and if we're not going to actually make them money, like if I myself in what I believe in can't make them money, then eventually we'll all be targets, right? You can do that across the spectrum of like environmental protections, education, healthcare, housing, food systems, right? All of these things, they're all getting gutted and targeted. And even for my own people, just, kind of referencing back to the last question is just like how do I have those conversations with our folks who think that they are not connected to this and to the broader like geopolitical scheme of things? They're not connected to national things. It's just not true. I mean, we have Native peoples in the South right now that are being targeted and asked for their IDs and their citizenship in almost being deported, you know? So it's just like there's so many things like this does affect us. We do have to make a stand on these things, right? Even around Palestine. What we're seeing happen now is a modern iteration of what we've already survived. It's the same playbook. Yes, new technology. Yes, a new face on an oppressor, right? But the structure, the strategy, and the process itself is the same thing, right? We're seeing that happen. And so for my own peoples, really pushing on them to remember what we went through and the fact that I wish someone in other peoples would have been there to push back for us and to say something for us in that moment when we could not. And we're just trying to survive, right? And so I think being holding on to that and holding on to our humanity, but really, yeah, just really looking at what are the opportunities of organizing right now. And it's typically where they're going to defund. And that's across the board, right? So just answering that quickly, check.
No, thank you. That was great. Mamadou, maybe you could talk for a second about what opportunities um, you see in this moment. Because it really does feel like on the one hand, we've never been under so much um authoritarianism as we are at the moment. And on the other hand, like there's all of this space that feels like it's opening up for the future. So where do you see that space in your own experience and more generally?
No, absolutely. I think materially, I think it's clear that the US is in a decline, right? The empire for me is in a decline. That's just a material fact. But that does not mean it's going to usher in a new world of egalitarian utopia, because we've seen what we've seen actually indicates the opposite, meaning that the USA will rather blow up the whole entire planet before it allows for egalitarian future. But I do think, given that is the objective material reality of the US, I think the time is absolutely ripe to build a mass movement in this country, in the United States. I think a mass movement is absolutely possible, because when we're talking about the solidarities and interconnections that we can build, it becomes a material question. And I obviously, as someone who's in like Black radical organizing spaces, and that's what I organize with, I even say to the folks that like, what does Palestine have to do with me? I'm saying, well, you care about your community's police officers, right? You care about the defunding of certain schools, right? This money that's being sent to these places could be used in our communities as well. So I keep trying to bring it back to a material question, but I think on the question what Krystal said about and about education is so important, because something that was apparent for me in my time in the United States, or Turtle Island rather, was that there has been a concerted effort to present our moments as disjointed and fragmented and not connected to any broader notion of a large history, which there is a large history of. For example, when the official declaration 1975 of Zionism being racism at the UN was first adopted at the African Organization of African Unity in Kampala in 1973, right? This was, and they emphatically declared that Zionism is racism. So I think whilst there is a case to be made about why materially be taking an anti-Zionist position is in the interest of the masses of the United States, and particularly masses of Black people as well. There's a question to be said that even in history of Black radical organizing, that the question of Palestine became central to Black liberation as well. So I think it's about bringing that up, highlighting that, and keep on exposing the contradictions briefly.
I'm being given the signal that it's just about time for us to wrap up. Paramita, since you haven't spoken in this round, I will offer you the opportunity to have the last word on anything that we've discussed, if you want it.
I'll try to say it in a minute. I do think Crystal brings up a really great point, at least I'm just thinking about the United States, about, looking at what's happening in our local communities in terms of what's being funded and what's not, and thinking about how are we thinking about the services and benefits that we all used to have, and where is that going in return for more policing, more law enforcement, more prisons, more jails, more war, more more everything that actually doesn't help people or communities thrive. And so I feel like that has been the underpinning for so much of the work that many of us are vested in, and have been vested in for a very long time. I think coming out of 9/11, right, where 600,000 Iraqis perished, right, in that war, and seeing the kind of devastation that wrought across the region, and remembering the impact that that had, not only on our communities, but also on our policies, on how we began to view the world, is something to keep in mind as we think about the wars that are coming our way, the expulsions, and the destruction that is happening in Gaza. I think I'm trying to be clear-eyed here. I'm not sure if our administration will be clear-eyed. I do hope that we're ready for mass movement, but if I think there we also need to be invested in infrastructure building and building connections. And so I think how we build those is a really important question for us to ask so that the solidarity that we build with each other can stand the test of a really bulked up militarized government imbued with many more powers than I think we've seen in the past. And so I'm looking forward to investing more time and more effort into those relationships while I skill up, and think about what it means to be the ally I need to be, in this time that we all actually need to be with each other, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a student, whether you're whatever. So whether you're an activist, all of it has to kind of work together.
Okay, amazing. I just threw that at you and you came back with something that brilliant. I mean, I bow down. Um, I think that just about wraps it up. Thank you to Paramita Shah, to Mamadou Tal, to Krystal Two Bulls, and to Dylan Saba, for just a brilliant conversation. I wish that we could go on for another 100 million hours, but everybody has lives to get back to, including the wonderful people who stayed the whole time to watch this. I was looking at the numbers. Most of you stuck around the entire time, which is very amazing. So thank you. And yeah, I think, this has been a really sort of enlivening conversation. And also, we're in a moment where it's very easy to feel real despair and isolation um, about both what's happening in the world and about our ability to do anything in response. And so having all of you together, sharing your insights with each other and with us, um, reminding us that uh, there is still, um, you know, a huge number of incredible people fighting the good fight, doing what needs to be done. That's the kind of thing that I keep with me in my lower moments. And so I thank you all for giving me and everyone else who's listening that little spark of hope today that I'm sure we all needed. So thank you all again, and thank you to Palestine Legal and to my bosses at the Nation. Can't forget them for hosting this, and have a wonderful rest of your evening, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jack. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Jack. Take care.